In 2021, Florida had a problem. A phosphate plant reservoir was failing, and 200 million gallons of contaminated wastewater needed to go somewhere immediately, or it would flood into Tampa Bay and kill everything. Environmental groups screamed that pumping it anywhere would cause ecological disaster. The state did it anyway, dumping the water into bone-dry wetlands that had been dead for decades. Within 72 hours, something impossible started happening. The dead wetlands came back to life. Not slowly over years, like ecological recovery usually works. Plants that hadn't grown there in 30 years started sprouting within a week. Birds that had abandoned the area for decades returned within 2 weeks. Fish appeared in waters that had been dust for a generation. Scientists expecting catastrophe found themselves documenting the fastest wetland recovery in recorded history. But here's what makes this story terrifying and hopeful at the same time. The wastewater that everyone predicted would poison the ecosystem actually saved it. The contaminated water that was supposed to kill everything instead brought dead land back to life. And the transformation happened so fast that it revealed something environmental science has been getting completely wrong about wetland restoration. This is what happened when Florida pumped 200 million gallons of treated wastewater into dry wetlands. Why the transformation defied every prediction, and what it means for the thousands of dead wetlands across America that everyone assumes are gone forever. Piney Point was a phosphate processing facility in Manatee County that closed in 2001. It left behind massive storage ponds filled with wastewater from phosphate mining. Billions of gallons of water contaminated with nitrogen, phosphorus, and heavy metals sitting in deteriorating reservoirs. For 20 years, those reservoirs slowly leaked and degraded while state officials argued about what to do with them. In March 2021, engineers discovered a leak in one reservoir that was expanding. The containment wall was failing. If it collapsed completely, 340 million gallons would flood into Tampa Bay uncontrolled. The phosphorus and nitrogen would trigger massive algae blooms that would suffocate marine life across the bay. It would be an environmental catastrophe that could take decades to recover from. Here's the impossible choice Florida faced. Let the reservoir fail and dump everything into Tampa Bay immediately, or do a controlled release into somewhere that could handle the water. The problem was, there was nowhere that could handle 200 million gallons of contaminated wastewater. Pumping it into the bay in controlled amounts was still environmental damage. Treating it before release would take months. They didn't have. Then someone suggested the Manatee County wetlands. These wetlands had been drained and dried out in the 1960s for development that never happened. For 60 years, they'd been abandoned. No water, no vegetation, no wildlife, just cracked earth and dead soil that used to be thriving marsh. Environmental groups immediately opposed the idea, predicting the contaminated water would finish killing what little remained of the ecosystem. But here's what the engineers realized that environmentalists missed. Wetlands are nature's water treatment systems. They evolved to filter water, remove contaminants, and process nutrients. The Manatee wetlands were dead because they had no water, not because the soil was destroyed. Even contaminated water, the wetland's natural filtration systems might activate. It was a gamble, but it was the only option that didn't guarantee disaster. On April 3, 2021, Florida started pumping 200 million gallons of treated wastewater from Piney Point into the dry Manatee wetlands. The flow rate was 35 million gallons per day. The immediate crisis was over. The failing reservoir was emptied enough to prevent catastrophic collapse. And then something nobody expected started happening. For the first 48 hours after water hit the dry wetlands, nothing visible happened. The cracked earth absorbed water like a sponge. The ground that had been powder dry for decades was suddenly mud again. Hydrologists monitoring the site expected it to take weeks for the water to even spread across the wetland area. Instead, the ground was saturated within 2 days. But here's what happened at the 72-hour mark. Green shoots started appearing. Tiny plants pushing through mud that had been lifeless desert 3 days earlier. The botanists monitoring the site couldn't identify them at first because they were seedlings. Within a week, they identified sawgrass, cattails, and bulrush. These are all native wetland plants that hadn't grown in that area since the 1960s. The question was how. These plants require wetland conditions to germinate. The seeds must have been dormant in the soil for 60 years, waiting for water to return. Botanists call this a seed bank, and it's common in wetlands. What wasn't common was the speed. Dormant seeds usually take months to germinate after water returns. These germinated in days. The nitrogen and phosphorus in the wastewater that was supposed to be toxic was actually acting as fertilizer. Wetland plants evolved to thrive in nutrient-rich water. The contamination everyone feared would poison the ecosystem was feeding it. The plants didn't just survive the wastewater, they exploded in growth because of it. By week 2, the transformation was visible from aerial photos. Green patches spreading across areas that had been brown dirt for decades. By week 3, the wetland vegetation covered 40% of the area that received water. By week 4, it was 65%. The growth rate was unprecedented. Scientists studying wetland restoration usually measure recovery in years or decades. This was happening in weeks. The vegetation return was shocking but explainable. The wildlife return was impossible according to standard ecological succession models. Ecological succession is the process by which ecosystems recover. Plants establish first, creating habitat. Insects arrive next, feeding on plants. Small animals follow, feeding on insects. Larger animals arrive last, creating a complete food web. This process typically takes 5–10 years minimum for wetlands. The Manatee Wetlands did it in 6 weeks. Here's what happened in week 3. Birdwatchers reported egrets, herons and ibis in the restored wetlands. These are wading birds that feed on fish and amphibians. The problem was there shouldn't have been any fish or amphibians yet. The water had only been there for 3 weeks. Where did their food source come from? Biologists investigated and found the answer. Fish eggs. The wastewater from Piney Point apparently contained fish eggs from the reservoir. When pumped into the wetlands, those eggs hatched. Mosquitofish, killifish, and small minnows appeared within 2 weeks. They multiplied rapidly in the nutrient-rich water. By week 3, there were enough small fish to support bird populations. But here's what broke the models completely. Amphibians appeared in week 4. Frogs and salamanders that require months to develop from eggs to adults were present as full adults. They couldn't have developed that fast. The only explanation was that they migrated from surrounding areas, somehow detecting that wetland habitat had returned and moving in within weeks. By week 6, alligators were spotted in the restored wetlands. Alligators are apex predators that require complete ecosystems to support them. They need fish populations large enough to sustain them, vegetation for cover, and suitable water conditions. The wetlands provided all of this in 6 weeks when it should have taken years. The wildlife return suggested something that challenged fundamental ecological understanding. The ecosystem hadn't died when the wetlands dried out. It had gone dormant. The seed banks in the soil, the fish eggs in the water, and the wildlife in surrounding areas were all waiting for the right conditions to return. When water came back, the ecosystem didn't slowly rebuild. It rapidly reactivated. The wastewater from Piney Point was contaminated. Nitrogen levels were 50 parts per million, phosphorus was 30 ppm, and there were trace amounts of heavy metals. These are concentrations that cause algae blooms and dead zones when released into bays or oceans. Environmental groups predicted the contamination would sterilize the wetlands even if water flow was restored. Here's what actually happened. Within 2 weeks, nitrogen levels in the wetland water dropped to 15 ppm. Phosphorus dropped to 8 ppm. Heavy metals were undetectable. The wetlands were filtering the contaminated water at rates that water treatment plants couldn't match. The mechanism was the plants. Wetland vegetation absorbs nitrogen and phosphorus as nutrients. They pull these contaminants out of the water and incorporate them into plant tissue. Cattails can remove 95% of nitrogen from water flowing through them. Sawgrass removes 90% of phosphorus. The explosive plant growth wasn't just recovery. It was a living water treatment system activating in real time. But here's the key insight that changed everything. Water treatment plants remove contaminants by chemical and mechanical processes. They produce clean water but generate toxic sludge that must be disposed of. Wetlands remove contaminants by converting them into plant biomass. The pollution doesn't disappear. It becomes vegetation. When plants die and decompose, those nutrients get locked into wetland soil rather than flowing downstream. Scientists monitoring the water quality at the output of the wetland area found that water leaving the wetlands was cleaner than the wastewater entering it. Not slightly cleaner, dramatically cleaner. The wetlands were functioning as a 400-acre natural water treatment facility. And they didn't cost billions of dollars to build. While scientists were focused on water quality and ecosystem recovery, something else was happening that nobody was monitoring at first. The restored wetlands were pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at extraordinary rates. Wetlands are among Earth's most efficient carbon sinks. Wetland plants photosynthesize like all plants, pulling CO2 from the air and converting it to plant matter. But wetlands also sequester carbon in soil. When wetland plants die in waterlogged conditions, they decompose slowly without oxygen. The carbon in their tissues gets locked into wetland soil as peat rather than released back into the atmosphere. Here's the calculation that shocked researchers when they finally ran it. The Manatee Wetlands restoration created approximately 400 acres of active wetland vegetation. Those wetlands were sequestering an estimated 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's equivalent to removing 430 cars from the road annually, from land that had been contributing nothing for 60 years, suddenly becoming a significant carbon sink. But here's the broader implication. There are 290 million acres of degraded or destroyed wetlands in the United States. If even 10% could be restored using wastewater reuse strategies, that's 29 million acres. At similar sequestration rates, that would remove 145 million tons of CO2 annually. That's equal to 31 million cars, or the entire annual emissions of the Netherlands. The climate benefit of wetland restoration is usually discussed in terms of preventing further loss. The Manatee case showed that restoring wetlands doesn't just preserve existing carbon sinks. It activates new ones in places that have been carbon neutral for decades. The standard approach to wetland restoration is expensive and slow. Hydrologists design water flow systems. Engineers build infrastructure to deliver clean water. Botanists plant native vegetation. Ecologists monitor recovery for years. A typical wetland restoration project costs $2,000 to $1,000,000 per acre and takes 5–10 years to establish functional ecosystems. The Manatee restoration was accidentally revolutionary because it ignored all of that. They didn't engineer careful water delivery systems. They pumped contaminated water as fast as possible to prevent a reservoir collapse. They didn't plant vegetation. The seed bank in the soil activated on its own. They didn't carefully manage the ecosystem. Nature did it automatically once water was present. The cost per acre was absurdly low. The pumping operation cost approximately $10 million for 400 acres of restoration. That's $2,500 per acre, but the infrastructure was temporary emergency pumps. Permanent wetland restoration using this method would be even cheaper. And the timeline was weeks instead of years. Here's what makes this applicable nationwide. America generates 34 billion gallons of treated wastewater daily from municipal treatment plants. Almost all of it gets discharged into rivers, lakes, or oceans. It's clean enough to not cause immediate harm, but still contains nutrients that contribute to algae blooms in dead zones downstream. What if that wastewater went to dry wetlands instead? The wetlands would benefit from the water. The nutrients would get absorbed by plants instead of flowing to waterways. The treatment plant discharge would create habitat instead of causing downstream problems. And thousands of degraded wetlands could be restored at a fraction of current costs. But here's the obstacle. Environmental regulations treat all wastewater as contamination. Even after treatment, discharging it into rivers is legal because rivers flow to the ocean where dilution handles the nutrients. Discharging it into wetlands is illegal because it's classified as polluting sensitive habitat. The regulations were written to protect ecosystems, but they prevent using wastewater for ecological restoration. The manatee case happened because it was an emergency that bypassed normal regulations. The success suggests those regulations are preventing solutions that could restore ecosystems faster and cheaper than current approved methods. The contamination everyone feared most was phosphorus. Phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in most freshwater ecosystems. Add phosphorus, and you trigger explosive algae growth that suffocates everything else. The Piney Point wastewater had phosphorus levels high enough to cause massive algae blooms if discharged into Tampa Bay. Here's what happened in the wetlands instead. But it was consumed by zooplankton and small fish within days. The phosphorus moved up the food chain rather than accumulating in the water. Wetland plants also absorbed phosphorus directly, pulling it from the water before algae could use it. The key difference was ecosystem complexity. Tampa Bay is a marine environment with limited capacity to process freshwater nutrients. The water would have created dead zones. The wetlands were freshwater environments specifically adapted to high nutrient loads. The phosphorus that would have been toxic in the bay was just fertilizer in the marsh. But here's the transformation nobody expected. The phosphorus didn't just get filtered out, it became the foundation of a productive ecosystem. The plants that absorbed it grew thick and fast. The algae that consumed it fed fish. The fish fed birds. The phosphorus that was classified as contamination became the nutrient base of a food web. This inverts the typical pollution narrative. We think of nutrients in wastewater as bad because they cause problems when discharged into the wrong places. The manatee case showed that nutrients aren't inherently bad. They're just resources in the wrong location. Put them in an ecosystem designed to process them, and contamination becomes fuel for life. The success of the manatee wetlands restoration should have immediately triggered national policy discussions about using treated wastewater for wetland recovery. It hasn't. The reason is uncomfortable for environmental regulators and water utilities. Current regulations require water treatment plants to remove as many nutrients as possible before discharge. Advanced treatment to remove nitrogen and phosphorus costs billions of dollars in infrastructure and millions annually in operating costs. Utilities pass these costs to customers through higher water bills. But here's what the manatee case revealed. That expensive nutrient removal might be solving the wrong problem. If treated wastewater went to wetlands instead of rivers, the nutrients wouldn't need to be removed. The wetlands would use them. Utilities could save billions on advanced treatment. Wetlands would be restored for free, and downstream waterways would receive cleaner water from restored wetlands than they currently get from treatment plant discharge. The obstacle is regulatory inertia. Rules written to protect water quality by removing nutrients are preventing a strategy that achieves better outcomes through ecological processing instead of mechanical treatment. There are 2,200 significant wastewater treatment plants in America. If even 10% partnered with nearby degraded wetlands for wastewater reuse, that's 220 restored wetland systems providing free water treatment, wildlife habitat, and carbon sequestration. The infrastructure costs would be pumping systems. The operational costs would be monitoring. Both are cheaper than advanced nutrient removal technology. So why isn't this standard practice? Environmental regulations treat wastewater as pollution regardless of treatment level. Discharging it into ecosystems requires proving it won't cause harm. This creates a regulatory burden that makes wetland wastewater reuse effectively impossible outside emergency situations. Water utilities have no incentive to pursue this. Their mandate is treating water to regulatory standards and discharging it. Wetland restoration isn't their responsibility. Even if wastewater reuse would save money long-term, the initial regulatory approval process is so burdensome that utilities avoid it. Environmental groups oppose wastewater discharge into wetlands on principle. The language of environmental protection equates wastewater with contamination. Suggesting that contaminated water could restore ecosystems is heresy even when the data supports it. The Manatee wetlands prove that decades of assumptions about wastewater toxicity and wetland fragility were wrong. The transformation was immediate, beneficial, and sustained. But changing environmental policy requires more than scientific evidence. It requires overcoming institutional resistance to ideas that challenge existing frameworks. Florida accidentally discovered that America has been spending billions to remove nutrients from wastewater before discharging it into rivers, when those same nutrients could be restoring dead wetlands at minimal cost while providing better water quality outcomes. The 200 million gallons pumped into dry wetlands wasn't a desperate emergency measure that happened to work. It was proof that we've been approaching wetland restoration and water treatment backwards for decades.